Just over a year ago, I reviewed a watch that most people had never heard of. And what I found really unusual about this is that it's a very inexpensive Seiko 5, nicknamed the Bottle Cap. And it looks pretty much just as the name describes, like a bottle cap, as it's wider kind of in the middle and then tapers as it goes to the top. It was just different, and I hadn't seen anything like it before or since. At least that was true until late this summer, when a brand new microbrand based out of Australia called Matthew & Sons launched a Kickstarter for their first watch, the Irukandji. And many of you probably saw a review of the early prototype back then. But production was finished in late October, and they're now selling them directly on their own site. Now, while I didn't keep the bottle cap, it's still a watch and a review that remain near and dear to my heart. Mostly because it was one of the most creative intros I've ever done, and I haven't done anything quite like it since. And I really don't know if the similarity between the bottle cap and Irukandji is intentional or just kind of happened that way. But either way, it just caught my attention and I was immediately interested in it. Especially because the biggest issue with the bottle cap was its size at 45 millimeters. That, and it really wasn't a real diver, more of a dive style watch, where the Irukandji is much more accessible at 42 millimeters, and it's a real diver with 200 meters of water resistance. Not to mention that while the case shape is similar, it just really has a style of its own, one that I think is more refined. The Irukandji just seems to flow more organically, so that it really resembles its own namesake, the Irukandji Jellyfish, more than, say, the industrial feel of a bottle cap. So I already had a big interest in the watch, so when the brand owner, Matthew Francis, reached out to me and asked if he'd give me one to review, I immediately said yes. I just really wanted to take a good look at it. Now, before we really jump into the Irukandji, I do want to point out that not only is Matthew & Sons working on their next watch, but they recently launched a new Kickstarter. But this time it's not for a watch, but for a very tiny portable micro tool for watches, and they're calling it the Tiny Time Tool. But let's get back to the Irukandji and look at the specs. The widest point of the watch is 42 millimeters, and as you can see, that's about a third of the way up from the bottom. And then it just tapers as it goes both up and down from there. So while it is a 42 millimeter watch, if you measure just at the very top, it's only 39.5. So it's a bit slimmer than you think. Now with the crown, it's only 43 millimeters, and lug to lug is only 46. So it not only looks, but also wears a bit smaller than your typical 42. To me, I think it actually feels more like a 40. And in some ways, if you're looking for a smaller diver or you're pining away for the death of the SKX 013, then this could be a good one to look at. Although it does have a total thickness of 15.3, so it is a bit tall. Yet that is with a very, very domed crystal. If you measure just from the caseback to the top of the bezel, it's just a little bit over 13. So overall, it's not too bad when you consider it does have the taller Seiko NH35A movement. And it also has a 20mm lug width, which is a little more unusual for a 42mm watch. Now, price is listed at 425 Australian for the watch, and that's with the nylon strap. If you want the bracelet, I think it's 490. And that translates to about 290 and 335 US dollars. So price-wise, it's right around that Zelos swordfish region. The case is 316 stainless, and it does have a brushed finish throughout it, at least until you get to the case back. And you'll notice here that rather than the horizontal brushing that you'd normally expect on a diver, here it's more vertical, going up and down, which I think really highlights and just kind of shows off the case shape, especially as you follow it down to the widest point, where it just sort of flattens out briefly before tapering back to the case back. Yet, one of the side effects here is that you can see more of the brushed lines, and I think it does give it more of an unfinished look, although I can tell you that everything is smooth to the touch. So I think some really won't like this, as it does make it look a little bit less refined. Yet I think some might actually appreciate it more, as it does really give it that tool watch look. For me, it's just kind of part of its unique charm, as I think it helps show off just how curved this case design really is. And that's something I really do love about the watch. As you look from the case to the bezel to the curved insert and to the top of the crystal, it all just seems to flow together organically. Even the lugs, even though they're not too curved, do seem just to fit in nicely with the design. While they are rather stubby, they do protrude down a bit. almost kind of like table legs, and this does enable you to use just a variety of different straps easily. And when you combine that with the drilled lugs, it just truly makes this watch a strap monster. Now, on the rear we do have a closed caseback, and I think it's one of the coolest casebacks I've run across, where it has a stamped design of the watch's namesake, the Irukandji Jellyfish. Now, the design here on the caseback just has enough depth to make the design just really stand out, but not so much that it alters how it wears. It just looks fantastic. There's also a signed screw-down crown, and it's at the 10 o'clock position here, which is a bit unique. Now, they do offer a version of it at the 4 for those that want something more conventional. The crown is a bit small, but it's pretty easy to get a hold of and manipulate. And it also is tucked in nicely to the case. While that 10 o'clock position is a bit odd, it really is the best way to keep the crown completely out of the way while wearing it. Although, I will say that because of that, I have put the watch on upside down more times than I'd like to admit. And as for the bezel, well, the finishing does match the case nicely, so it just really blends in. And I really like the tapered coin edge here as it goes up, where it just meets this beautiful dark blue ceramic insert. And as you can see, there really isn't much of an edge between that ceramic insert and the bezel, so it all just really blends together. As you'd expect, the bezel is 120 click and unidirectional. But the bad news here is that it does have more backplay than I'd like, and I think it almost goes back a full click, so about half a minute. Yet, I have to admit that this is one of the easiest bezels I've ever run across to get a hold of and turn. And I think that's because of how it's integrated into the case design, where it just kind of becomes the top of that case. So it's just really easy to get a hold of no matter what. Now, as for the crystal, well, as I said, it's just a really, really domed sapphire, and there is AR on the underside. And I do believe that it is a single domed sapphire, as there's always a bit of a distortion here. Not to mention this funhouse mirror effect you sometimes get. Now, when it comes to that distortion, some people really love it as it kind of brings a vintage feel to it, while others just hate it and just really want to see the dial clearly as possible. For me, it's really about how it plays into the overall design, and here I think it works rather well. Not just in how it completes the overall shape, but I think that it does enhance the appearance of the dial underneath it, especially those larger indices. While at some angles it can make the watch harder to read, most of the time those clear white hands and indices against the blue backdrop are just easy to make out. But as for the dial itself, now this is the blue version, but there are also currently a black and pink dial version. Not to mention I think there are 3 more possible on the horizon. Yet the blue here is just striking and just pairs beautifully with that bezel. I think it's one of the best sunburst blue dials I've run across, and I'm not just saying that. I think the only bad shots I've gotten of this thing were my own fault where I had a smudge on the crystal. Otherwise, it just looked fantastic no matter what the angle. The indices are painted on in this thick white lume, and I think it looks great against the dial, but I do wish they used more so there was a little bit more depth. And as you go past the indices, you do see a very raised chapter ring. It's really vertical, so much so that if you're looking at the watch dead on, you almost don't see the chapter ring. But it's always there at some capacity at pretty much every other angle. So it's kind of there when you're looking for it, but otherwise it just kind of blends into the background. Which is something I can't really say for the date. It's at the 3 and it does kind of throw off the symmetry a little. Yet it is framed really nicely, and that white date wheel does match up nice with the other indices. Now for the hands, there's a sword minute and this kind of syringe hour hand. And the hour hand is a bit short here. And this is then all followed by a very thin silver stick for a second hand, and it does have a circular counterweight at the back. But the interesting thing here is that the back half is blue, so it just sort of blends into the dial, and leaves you with this floating white lume circle going around. It's a cool effect, but I think the second hand overall is a bit too thin. But as there are no polished metal edges framing the indices, the metal second hand does stick out against the blue backdrop. The lume here is, well, it's interesting. It's a blue Superluminova BGW9, but for whatever reason, it seems to be almost a darker shade than other BGW9 watches I've had. In fact, the dial itself does seem to be a darker shade than the hands or the bezel. Not to mention the dial is also a bit dimmer. Now, I really do love the way the lume looks here, especially with that domed crystal. How the distortion plays with it is just really cool. But while I do love the look here, overall the lume is just okay, and I wish it was a little better. As you can see in this comparison test, it's not quite Seiko good. And the lume on the dial is really disappointing. It just vanishes far sooner than the bezel, which is usually the opposite of what happens. Now, movement-wise, we do have a Seiko NH35A, so you get the usual 48 hour power reserve, hacking, and hand winding. And with the Irukandji at around $300 US, I do think it's kinda at the top of where I'd like to see the NH35, but you're not quite to the point where you'd expect a Miyota 9015, so I think it is perfectly appropriate here. Matthew & Sons also lists that each movement is regulated, so there is an added benefit there. And personally, I was only losing about 3.5 seconds a day, and you can't complain about that. I think this watch really goes with just about any strap out there. Yet each watch does come with a 2-piece matching nylon, and you also have an option for a rivet-style bracelet. Now, Matthew & Sons did send me both of those, as well as a tropic-style strap, and I'll quickly go over each of them. The nylon strap is definitely a bold choice, and I think even bolder with the pink version. It's a thicker nylon with a quick release, and it does seem to be pretty good quality. It is a bit stiff and maybe a little bit rough, but it looks great and even wears great after a little bit of breaking in. Yet, it was my least favorite out of the three. Now, with the black tropic strap, I think it not only looked better, but was also more comfortable to wear. And overall, it's just a really simple, very comfortable tropic-style strap. And my only issue with it is there really isn't any branding on it. So it does seem a bit generic, and I'd really love to see a Matthew & Sons logo on it. And last, we do have the rivet-style bracelet, and this is easily my favorite out of the bunch. And I think it really just transformed the way the watch looked as well. The bracelet has a brushed finish, with the exception of the polished rivet-like sides. It has a really nice smooth finish to the touch, and it does start out at 20mm and then tapers down to about 18 before you get to a signed milled clasp, which I think makes an already comfortable watch even more comfortable to wear. Now, I would really love it if it had end links that formed into the case, but because of how those low lugs hang, I'm not really sure it'd be possible, or even look right if you did. And I would prefer it if the clasp was push button. Other than that, it's really just a great bracelet. It's also an extremely comfortable watch to wear, especially on that bracelet. It just seems to have a good weight and balance where it just stays exactly where it's supposed to. And it just has this remarkable presence, especially this blue version, without being overly large. So overall, it's just a beautiful, uniquely looking watch with only a few minor things holding it back. And it's not like the lume or the bezel are bad. It's just I think they could be better, especially when you compare it to other microbrands around the same price. And this is something I hope they improve while moving forward. Now the thing is here, and to be perfectly honest, if the Irukandji had just looked like any other dive watch, I think this would be the end of the story, and I'd tell you to go look at those other watches. And if you really don't like the design, I'd probably still tell you to go look at those other watches. But this isn't just any other watch or subby look-alike. This is a watch that's more about the design and just the uniqueness of it. And if the design happens to resonate with you, I think you'd be willing to give the lume and bezel a little more leeway. In a lot of ways, I think Matthew & Sons and the Irukandji really represent what microbrands are supposed to be, where it's a small business in which a handful of people really sit down and try to design a watch that really represents their ideals, where they're not just sitting down trying to create a great selling watch, but really what they think a great watch should be. The end result might not be something that appeals to everyone, but it's definitely going to have character and stand out in a crowd. But what do you think about all this? Not just about the Irukandji, but as well as just what do you think microbrands should be? Let me know down below in a comment. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.